Africa is the world's second largest continent, and it's rich in both natural and human resources. But for much of its recent history, Africa has been poor. Why? Now, we've talked about colonialism before, how people from Europe colonized most of the world in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And we'll talk more about decolonization later. But right now, we're going to focus on how colonization affected Africa specifically. Before the European colonization of Africa, there were many different states and societies there with rich cultures and economies. But starting in the 1400s, Europeans began exploring and sailing around the west coast of Africa, and they began to conquer and control various African societies. They forcibly moved many Africans to the Americas as enslaved people, and they took control of trade routes that had connected Africa to the Middle East and Asia. Even though colonization of Africa didn't really start in earnest until later, this was still an important step in getting Africa ready for colonization. European powers like Portugal continued to explore and fight over coastal areas in Africa, but it wasn't until the late 1800s that they began to scramble for control of the entire continent. This scramble was driven by a number of factors like competition between European powers, the desire for natural resources, and new markets for manufactured goods. But it was also fueled by racist ideologies that Europeans used to justify their conquest and rule over other peoples, including the idea of the white man's burden, which said that Europeans had a duty to bring their culture and religion to non-white peoples. By the 1900s, almost all of Africa was colonized. European powers divided the continent into colonies, spheres of influence or protectorates, and they imposed their own political systems, economies, and cultures on the people and places they colonized. These European colonies in Africa extracted huge amounts of wealth from the continent in the form of raw materials like gold, diamonds, and rubber, as well as through cheap or free labor. They grew cash crops like coffee, cocoa, and cotton on large plantations for export. They also forced people to work in mines or on farms as a source of cheap labor. In addition, Europeans built few and often poor quality schools and medical facilities in Africa. Unlike in some of their other colonies in Asia, European powers did not generally encourage industrialization in Africa, so most manufacturing was done in Europe. As a result, many manufactured goods that Africans needed were expensive and hard to get, and that made it difficult for any kind of industrial economy to develop in Africa. In addition, because colonization disrupted traditional African economies and ways of life, many Africans became even poorer during this time period. But it's important to remember that just because something is poor doesn't mean it has no wealth. For example, despite terrible working conditions, gold mining in South Africa brought a lot of wealth to the nation as a whole, even if it enriched relatively few people. Now, the effects of colonization varied across Africa. Some places were more integrated into the colonial economy than others, and some suffered more than others from the extraction of resources and people. Additionally, the effects of colonization continue to be felt today, even after most African nations gained independence in the mid to late 1900s. For example, the borders that European powers drew across Africa didn't always follow pre-existing ethnic or cultural boundaries, which caused problems later when those areas wanted to become independent. And because colonization disrupted traditional economies and ways of life, many newly independent African nations had to work to rebuild their economies and societies. That being said, many African nations have achieved independence, but they continue to work toward economic and political freedom from the effects of colonization. One way we can tell that African nations are taking steps to achieve this is by looking at initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area, which aims to reduce trade barriers and increase trade between African nations. So to review, prior to colonization, Africa was home to many powerful states and societies, but beginning in the late 1400s, Europeans explored and conquered areas of the continent. By the 1900s, nearly all of Africa was colonized by European powers. During the scramble for Africa, European powers extracted massive amounts of wealth from the continent through the forced labor of Africans and the export of raw materials. Colonization also had significant social and cultural effects, including the spread of European languages and religions and the disruption of traditional economies and ways of life. The effects of colonization continue to be felt in Africa today, even after most African nations achieved independence in the mid to late 1900s. Many African nations are taking steps to achieve economic and political freedom from the effects of colonization. One way we can tell that these nations are achieving this goal is by looking at initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area, which aims to reduce trade barriers and increase trade between African nations. Next time, we're gonna look more closely at what decolonization looks like around the world. Many maps and borders represent modern geopolitical divisions that have often been decided without the consultation, permission, or recognition of the land's original inhabitants. Many geographical place names also don't reflect the indigenous or aboriginal people's languages. For the indigenous and aboriginal people of this land, we encourage you to learn about the history of the place you call home through resources like Native Land CA and by engaging with your local indigenous and aboriginal nations through the websites and resources they provide.